So it was the first day of kindergarten, and the kindergarten teacher pulled one of the little boys aside and said, "Do you know your numbers?" And he said, "I do. My dad taught me." And she said, "Well, let's see how many of those numbers you know." She said, "Do you know what comes after 2?" He said, "Yes, 3. "How about what comes after 5? 6, said the little boy. "How about 8? 9, he said. "Okay, here's a hard one," the teacher said. "What comes after 10? And the boy thought for a minute, and he said, "A jack." Happy Father's Day, everybody. First, a little bit of history about Father's Day. It started, first of all, in 1906 in Spokane, Washington, a woman by the name of Sonoma Louise Smart Dodd went to a Mother's Day service. And she was the oldest of 6 kids, and her father was widowed, so her father raised her. And then he ended up remarrying and had 8 more kids with his second wife. And so she was raised with 14 kids. And she thought, how come we honor moms, but we don't honor dads? And so she made it her life's mission to come up with some way to honor fathers. So in May of 1910, she made a petition to the Spokane Ministerial Alliance. And she suggested June 5th as a day to honor fathers, because that was her father's birthday. But that alliance thought it was too quick. They couldn't put it together that quickly. So they decided on the 3rd Sunday in June. It wasn't official, but they honored, in Spokane, Washington, they honored dads on that day. Then in 1916, President Woodrow Wilson recognized Father's Day and encouraged Americans to celebrate on that 3rd Sunday. Then in 1924, President Calvin Coolidge did the same thing. Now, this wasn't a formal holiday yet. It was still somewhat informal. And it was celebrated for many, many years. 42 years after, in 1966, Lyndon B. Johnson signed a presidential declaration that declared the 3rd Sunday of June Father's Day and an official holiday. And that's what we're celebrating today. Welcome to Father's Day. So if you're a dad, we celebrate you. Maybe you had a great dad. Maybe he's still around, and maybe not. While we love celebrating our fathers, we also need to celebrate those mothers, like Reverend Juanita talked about, that served as fathers, and people in our life that served as those father figures. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a little while. So what I want to celebrate really are the qualities of fatherhood. Those people who showed up in our life and supported us the way we think a father shows up. So what are the qualities of a good dad? If you're from my generation, a father was the provider and their protector. And when I say that, the first thing that comes to mind is that first caveman Og, right, with the big club, taking care of his family and out there hunting and collecting things so he could provide for his family. Fathers were also disciplinarians, but they also provided affection and affirmation, encouragement and wisdom. A good dad is dependable and patient. He's involved with his kids. He's empathetic and compassionate. He's playful, and he's dedicated to his family. A dad like that was somebody we trusted, somebody we relied on no matter what, someone we knew was always there. If your child needed food or shoes, would you hesitate even for a moment to get that for them? Of course not. We think about a father that way, that if his child needs something, he'll provide it. It's really about trusting, and this is how we learn how to trust. This is how we learn how to trust life. It's how we learn how to trust God, and it's how we learn how to trust ourselves and that spirit within us. And sometimes life creates situations where trusting isn't so easy. And that's when time and experience come into play. Because some people have to learn trust through the school of hard knocks, right? Through difficult times, they learn to trust themselves and lean on themselves and rely on that spirit, that light, that father, if you will, within. What we learn from our fathers is very different from what we learn from our moms, right? We learn nurturing from our mothers. From our fathers, we learn about protecting and providing, and most kids believe their father's always right, that he'd never lie to them, never betray them. Most kids idolize their dads. They trust that he's always going to be there whenever they're in trouble. Jesus said, "Come to me like a little child," or like little children. That means come open, come trusting. And we can't talk about Jesus and fathers without recognizing the Heavenly Father. And as Reverend Juanita said, we don't see God having a gender. We see God as that power and presence, that creative source of all that there is, that spark of life that created the entire universe, that lives in every one of us. So while we don't believe that God has a gender, we do believe that we have a connection always with that power and presence. And I like to say it's rock solid, especially if you have a spiritual practice. You're creating that foundation, that sense of solidness. So we look to our dads for protection, affection, and affirmation. They're our first heroes, aren't they? And this is their love language: protection, affection, and affirmation. So let's start with protection. The world can be a really scary place, especially for little ones, right? And in comparison to a tiny child, dads are seen as big and strong and like the giants and kings that we see and hear about in fairy tales. Dads keep us safe. They teach us useful skills, like how to cross the road or how to ride a bike. They take us into the world and they empower us. Sigmund Freud said, "I can't think of any need in childhood as strong as the need for a father's protection." There's something really natural about fathers defending their children. It's not something that has to be taught. It's something that's born in them when their child shows up. One of the most profound and beautiful examples in nature of a strong and powerful father and an engaged father is the emperor penguin. When the penguin is ready to have a baby, lay an egg, if you will, the female carries that egg around and nurtures it until about 2 months before it's time to hatch. And that's when she lays the egg, 2 months before it's time for that egg to hatch. She takes the egg over to the father. She puts it on his feet and balances it between his feet. And then she takes off into the ocean because it's taken all the resources and all the food stores within her to grow that egg and lay that egg. So now she needs to go and replenish those stores. So the father takes over. He lowers his body and his fur around that egg to keep it warm because it's awful cold in the Antarctic, right? And he stands there. There's no nest for him to rest in. He just stands. He barely moves because he doesn't want to damage that egg. So he barely moves. He stands there. He doesn't even eat for 2 whole months, taking care of that egg. And there's something instinctual in the female. She knows when it's time to come home. So she's out for 4 to 6 weeks in the ocean, maybe even 8 weeks, until that instinct is turned on. And then she returns. All that while, she's feeding and restoring her stores. So when she gets back and the egg hatches, she takes over, and the father goes into the ocean to replenish his stores. And then a couple months later, he comes back, and they share in the parenting responsibilities until that chick is ready to be on their own. I think that's a beautiful story and a beautiful example of shared parenting and the responsibility and how important it is to have the energy of both the male and the female. There are traditions among many indigenous nations that are practiced when it's time for a young boy to become a man. And one of those traditions is a tradition where the father takes the boy into the wilderness and has him sit on a stump for the whole night with a blindfold on. Now, he tells his son about this ahead of time so the son doesn't get too scared. And in this particular case, it was time for this young man to become this young boy to become a man. So his father says, "Okay, it's time, let's go." He takes them far out into the wild, and he has his son sit on a stump. He puts the blindfold on his son's eyes, and he says, okay, now you'll sit here until the sun shines on your face. You can't take the blindfold off until the sun comes up. You must sit here on this stump, not remove the blindfold, and not get up for any reason until morning, and then you will have passed, and you will be a man. He kissed the boy on the head, and he walked away. And the boy heard his father's footsteps walking away, and he sat there, and he started to get scared. And it started to get dark, and he started to hear animal noises, and he got even more scared. And he was shaking on that stump, and the wind started to blow, and he heard the trees rustling, and he heard animals, all kinds of animals in the woods and in the wild. And so he just sat there shivering on that stump. Well, finally, morning came. He felt the sun on his face. So he took the blindfold off, and on a stump, just 10 feet away, he saw his dad, protecting him and watching over him all night. See, we look to our dads for that kind of protection. We also look to our fathers for affection. And in our society, that can be hard. We've been shaped by a culture that says men can't show feelings. But I'm really happy to say that that's changing now, isn't it? It's okay for a man to show up vulnerable. In fact, vulnerability is often a sign of strength, not weakness. But it used to be that manliness showed up as stoicism, right? And some men had a hard time expressing any emotion except anger. If we recognize a father's affection, though, as sharing time and space with us, in sharing activities, and learning the important things of life, like how to ride a bike or drive a car or play sports, or in the stories that he tells about his own childhood, then we can appreciate that love showing up, that affection showing up in those ways. And sometimes a father's love shows up as patience, because he teaches us by example, doesn't he? So there was a young man, just about 30 years old, who went to visit his dad. And he had 2 children, 3 and 1. And he was sitting in the living room with his father, and he said, Dad, I'm really struggling with something, and I'd love to have your feedback. I'd love to have your advice about this. And the father said, okay, son, what is it? And the young man said, well, I'm really having a hard time being patient. I love the kids so much, but boy, they get on my last nerve sometimes, and I lose it. I have a really hard time with patience, and I want to be more patient. And the father thought for a while, and he looked out the picture window, and he said to his son, what's that? And the son said, well, it's a crow on the branch. And the father nodded, and he thought for a moment, and then he said, son, what's that? And the boy said, it's a crow. Sure enough, the father asked him a third time, what's that? And the young man said, a crow, it's a crow. And he shook his head, and a minute later, the father said, son, what's that? And the young man said, Dad, it's a crow, I've told you 4 times it's a crow. What's going on? Can you not see it? Can you not hear it? What's going on? And the father just smiled, and he stood up, and he went into the other room, and the man heard his father rustling around in the other room, and he came out with an old journal with a tattered cover and yellow pages. And he said, he flipped through the journal, and he found a page, and he put the journal in front of his son, and he said, read this. And the journal said, today I sat with my 3-year-old boy on the sofa. We looked out the big picture window in the living room, and a crow landed on a branch. What's that, Dad? He asked. I responded, a crow. He repeatedly asked me about that bird over and over and over again. In fact, he asked me 23 times, and 23 times I told him it was a crow. I had to count because that's the only way I couldn't lose my patience. I had to make it a game. Finally, we went outside to see it, and it flew away. My boy cried. I hugged him, and we went inside. The young man looked up from reading the journal, and the father said to him, "You want to go outside, son?" He nodded. So they went outside, and the crow flew away. The young man cried, and the father hugged him. So we look to our fathers for affection, and we look to them for affirmation. We want their approval. Love shows up often that way. All children want to know that their father's proud of them, right? It's important for a father to validate and encourage their child, to let them know they believe in them, that they can be and do anything they want to be or do in the world. There's a book called Overcoming the Dark Side of Leadership, and it's written by Gary McIntosh and Samuel Rima. And it talks about the need we all have for paternal affirmation and what can happen if we don't get it. They say that this is the root cause of low self-esteem and insecurity that creates behaviors like overeating and compulsive spending and alcoholism, drug abuse, gambling. They say visit any jail and you'll find a high percentage of those incarcerated never got love from their fathers. And sometimes not hearing that a parent is proud of you can also show up as an addictive pursuit of wealth and success, power and fame. The book contains over 100 different case studies that show how the extremes of addiction and compulsive drive can result in a father's inability to validate their son or daughter. In addition to criminals and athletes and business people and preachers, some of the people profiled in this book are presidents. 3 in particular: Abraham Lincoln, John F. Kennedy, and Bill Clinton. I'll give you an example of just Abe. So Abraham Lincoln, one of the greatest presidents in the United States, had a very difficult childhood. His mother died when he was only 9 years old. He was teased for being tall and gangly and awkward and not so good looking. His father remarried a woman with 3 children, and they were much younger than Abe was. And so his father focused his attention on those young kids and didn't give Abe much attention. He even criticized him and put him down on a pretty regular basis. Told him he couldn't do the things he wanted to do. He couldn't accomplish those dreams that he had. And Abe grew up then with an I'll show you kind of an attitude. The rift between Abe Lincoln and his father was so deep that Abraham Lincoln did not go to his father's funeral. McIntosh and Rima write, Abraham Lincoln's sense of inferiority and his lack of self-worth drove him to achieve a level of success and influence that would provide a salve for his painful childhood wounds. John F. Kennedy and Bill Clinton were similarly motivated. Instead of ending up in jail, these guys, like so many others, lived a life where drive and ambition were fueled by their need for validation. They looked to get that out there instead of looking in here, because without their father's approval, they didn't know it was available to them. They didn't realize that it was something that had to build and grow within them. They weren't able to touch that spark or that solid rock within them. We even hear about the importance of a father's approval in the Bible. Do you know there's 86 places in the Bible where we're told that God is pleased? The most well-known is Luke 3:22, where we're told God approves of Jesus. It says, and the Holy Spirit descended on him in bodily form like a dove. And a voice came from heaven, you are my beloved Son, with whom I love. With you I am well pleased. And in Matthew 17:5, we read, he was still speaking to the crowd, although many were not listening, when a bright cloud overshadowed them all, and a voice from the cloud said, this is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him. See, we look to our dads for acceptance, approval, for companionship, for our sense of value, worth, and dignity. We look to them for confidence. We look to them for wisdom and guidance. So in preparing for this talk, I looked up some golden nuggets that famous people have shared about the lessons and the wisdom they got from their own dads. James Taylor, we all know James Taylor, that famous musician, he said that his father taught him to maintain a work-life balance, that he always remembered that. And even when he was on the road, he tried to find time to connect with his kids. Football quarterback Joe Montana learned from his dad to stick things out, to honor his commitments. When he was 11 years old, he joined a football team, and at the third practice, he decided he wanted to quit. So he went to his dad and said, "Dad, I want to quit football." And his father said, "That's fine, but not until the end of the season. You've made a commitment, and you will stick it out." Billionaire Mark Cuban from Shark Tank, an entrepreneur, he said, "When I was in grade school, I was one of only 2 Jewish kids in the whole school. Name-calling wasn't unusual, so I got into a lot of fights. Every time I did, my dad would tell me, 'People who hate have already lost the battle.'" He said, "Treating others with respect is the most important thing. Everybody's the same inside," he said. Mark Cuban then said, "I didn't understand what he meant by losing when you showed hatred until one day when I was in the 5th grade. Everybody was picking on this one fat kid. He said, I thought it would be cool to punch him. So I walked right up to him and punched him in the stomach." And he started crying. "I never felt so terrible," Cuban said. "I knew exactly what my dad was trying to tell me. Hurting someone through words or actions leaves the biggest scar on the person who threw the punch." I think about that lesson a lot, he said. And Jim Carrey learned some wisdom from his father, not from his father's success, but from his father's failure. He said, "My father could have been a great comedian, but he didn't believe he was good enough. So instead, he went the conservative route and became an accountant. And when I was 12 years old, he got fired. And for the next several years, we struggled. My dad did anything and everything he could do to put food on the table. I learned many great lessons from my dad," he said, "not the least of which is that you can fail at something you don't want to do. So you might as well take a chance and do what you love." Tory Burch, the American fashion designer, learned from her dad that you get more bees from honey than you do from vinegar. She said, "He taught me to be nice to everyone, no matter who they were or how they were behaving." And Bill Gates says his dad encouraged him to do the things he wasn't good at. Bill says, "He always told me, it's okay to make mistakes. That's why pencils have erasers." Audra Kirshner, the CEO and founder of the Ambitious Dollar, says, "The best piece of advice my dad ever gave me was look where you want to go. If you're looking where you don't want to go, that's where you'll end up." The first time I remember him sharing this with me was when I was learning to ride my bike, she says. But it resonated with me ever since in so many other areas of my life. So many of us focus on what we don't like, what we don't have, what we don't want, instead of what we do like, what we do have, and what we do want. This resonated with me because this is one of the basic foundational principles of the science of mind. We call it a spiritual prototype or mental equivalence. And on page 213 of the Science of Mind textbook, my buddy Ernie says, "The law of mental equivalence means that everything that is consciously and subjectively embodied in our thinking tends to radiate an atmosphere, a vibration, a current of thought, an inward acceptance which automatically attracts itself and that which is like itself." My own dad taught me lots of lessons, some really difficult to learn. In fact, my relationship with him was kind of a bookend. When I was very, very young, I have fond memories of that affection from him. In fact, he used to work the swing shift, and he'd come home about 11 o'clock, and he'd always come into my room and get me up. And this memory is from about 2.5, 3, maybe until I was about 4. Every night he came home from work, he'd go in my room, take me out of my bed, put me in the middle of the dining room table, and he'd sit down to have his dinner. Now, my dad was Mediterranean, so he used to eat things like black olives, sardines, smoked oysters. He loved French bread and blue cheese. Well, guess what? I love those things to this day. And those are some wonderful memories and a time when I really felt a lot of love from him. The other time that I felt a lot of love from him was towards the end of his life. All those years in between, not so much. But there's something that's really positive that came from that. First, I want to tell you about the end of his life experience. So about a year before my father passed, my brother called me and said, Dad's having a real hard time. And I was the closest. I was in California and he was in Arizona. So my brother said, would you think about going out there and spending some time with him and helping him? And of course, I said I would do that. So I started going out to Arizona on a pretty regular basis to help my father. And I went a couple times a month, taking him to the doctor and getting his groceries and doing his laundry and doing a lot of those things. A lot of the healing that needed to happen happened silently during that time. There's something else that happened in the silence that I want to share with you, and it happened about 2 weeks before my father passed. I was sitting in his living room, and now by this time he was getting dementia. He had difficulty hearing and seeing, but he liked to watch TV. He liked to listen to the news. So he would sit in his lazy boy chair with big earphones on so he could hear the news really loud and wouldn't bother all the neighbors. And so he was watching the news, listening to the news, and I was sitting in another chair reading. And I realized pretty soon that 2 hours had passed and we hadn't even shared a word. And so I stood up and I went over to him and I said, Hey, Dad, do you need anything? Is there anything I can get for you? And he said, No, honey, I'm fine. And I said, I'm really sorry that so much time has gone by and we haven't chatted, and I'd like to talk to you about, your life, and I'd love it if you want to tell me some stories, and I'm sorry that we've been quiet for so long. And he looked at me and he said, I never liked ketchup. And I looked at him going, What? Okay. Thinking, okay, these chains of thought aren't really connected. And then he said, I never liked ketchup, but I always loved hamburgers and French fries. And that's true. He always loved burgers and fries, and he always loved meat, but he never, ever had ketchup on any of it. He said, when you like the meat, you don't need the ketchup. When you like the companionship, you don't need conversation. That was one of the most poignant lessons and most powerful experiences I ever had with him. And like I said, a lot was healed quietly in that silence I spent with my father. Not so many people, not everybody has a perfect relationship with their fathers. Some are better than others, but no matter what the relationship, there is something in it for every one of us, for them and for us. So I invite you to think a little bit about your own father, about anyone who is a father figure in your life, those people who taught you those important lessons. Maybe like me, you also had a spiritual or a surrogate dad. So bring that person into your heart. Bring anyone into your heart who provided that protection, affection, and affirmation to you. And know that they did it the best way they could. And be grateful for them. Be grateful for that hand that you were dealt. And now I want to invite you to come up here to this table up here. And what I've got set up are some candles and some rocks. And I love rocks. I love rocks. I'm going to talk about rocks probably every time I come here because I love rocks and I love to carry them around in my pocket. And when I think about a father, I think about that rock solid presence. It doesn't have to be a biological father, but a person who is there for us all the time, no matter what. So what I invite you to do is take one of these sticks. You're going to use this God candle that represents that light of that Father, Mother, God, that presence within us and within everybody, and light one of these small candles in honor of that father figure or that idea of fatherhood. And then stick the stick back in the dirt, take a rock, and then return to your seat.
everything you have taught me, everything you give, and everything you have taught me, the way you love me. Ooh, I light a candle for your love. I light a candle for your love. I light a candle for your love. For loving me, bringing me life. For loving me, bringing me life. For loving me, loving me, loving me, loving me, loving me, and bringing me life. Ooh. Bringing me life, bringing me love, bringing me protection, bringing me love, bringing me life, bringing me love, bringing me protection. Ooh, bringing me life, bringing me love, being my protection, bringing me life, bringing me love, being my protection. Oh, ooh, ooh, I light a fire for your love. I light a candle with the fire of your love, burning bright, burning bright, burning bright.
So everybody have a rock? Okay. Hang on to it today. If you want to keep it in your pocket forevermore, you can do that, or you can find a wonderful place to leave it. But I invite you to hang on to it through this day today and remind yourself of what is rock solid in your life. And don't forget about the ketchup. The ketchup isn't important if the meat is good. The conversation isn't important if there's love between those people. So the next time you find yourself in awkward silence, just remember the ketchup. How about we pray? So recognizing that light that lives in everyone, that's everywhere in everything. Because I know there's no spot where God is not. Today I recognize those masculine qualities of God. That idea of protection. Of affirmation, of appreciation and love. And I feel that radiating from within me because I know it comes from that spark of the divine. And not only do I know this for myself, I know this for each person here. That fatherhood, those qualities of fatherhood, are simply a thought away. And for me, this rock reminds me of that. And so what I know for each person here is as they move through this day, there's an appreciation for that person or those people in our lives who have taught us this kind of love. Because it's a fact that we love the way we are taught to love. And so today we honor those fathers and that power and presence that we know as fatherhood. We honor every person who's been that for us, and we honor it within each of ourselves. We see it in those people that we look into their eyes. We see it as we look around the world because it's reflecting back to us. And so it's with a full heart and so much love and gratitude that I release my word, calling it good because I know that it is. And so it is. Amen.
And so it is. Thank you. Thank you so much.